And welcome back to Sullivan's Unheard Voices. I'm here with Ciera. I can't thank you enough for being on this podcast because, okay, I have always had a fascination with bees, right? I'm always the kind of person that puts bee flowers out for bees and all that stuff. I kind of understand, the importance of bees. But, then you hear things like in a beehive, the males aren't allowed to stay all year round.
This is true. Yep.
That's shocking to me.
Yes.
How does that work?
Nature just has this really amazing way of doing things. And so actually the worker bees are the ones that do all of the making the honey, and they're the ones that, take care of the queen and protect the hive. And the drones, they're the male bees.
Yeah.
They just have their one job, and that's to, mate with the queen in the springtime. And once they get that kind of out of the way, they're not really needed the rest of the year. So there's really no reason to keep them around. So they're just really efficient, and they kick them out, and then they raise more in the spring again.
And they just completely die off every year.
Sometimes if it's a milder winter, they'll keep some drones around, but for the most part, they're just kind of useless eaters in the hive, and they just kick them out.
That's so fascinating. Yeah. That's so fascinating. And what about the process to select a queen?
Yes. So the queen, she takes about, I believe it's about 16 days from egg to hatching. And they feed her this really rich diet of royal jelly. If you've ever heard of royal jelly,
yeah.
It's a product of the hive. And they've actually done studies, and they've given royal jelly to preemie babies, human babies, to help them grow. And so the royal jelly will actually help the queen develop into a queen with all of her special reproductive organs that make her different than the worker bees are, because the worker bees are all female. All the honey that's made is from female bees, and they're the ones with the stingers and protect the hive. And the queen doesn't do any of that. She just lays about 2,000 eggs a day in her hive in the darkness. So I don't think it's all that great to be the queen.
Right.
It'd be kind of a very, dark, busy lifestyle. Not like just sitting around wearing the crown by any means. But and then once she hatches and emerges, she actually will go out. They call it her mating flight, and she'll go out, and there's a drone congregation area. They'll find her, and she'll mate with, there's not a lot of science on how the queens mate, but they think that it's somewhere between 15 and 20 drones. And then they come back to their hive, and then they develop, a larger abdomen it's longer, so it can fit down into the honey, into the comb cell, the bottom of the cell. She can deposit the egg in the very bottom of the cell. And then she lives for 1 to 2 years. And then when she starts to decrease her number of egg production, they just supersede her, is what it's called. And they create a new queen, and then the cycle goes on.
Wild. And so when the queen lays the egg at the bottom, then the drone, not the drones, but the worker bees are the ones that put the fluid on top of the egg.
Yes. Yeah.
And so that's fascinating.
Yes.
And the fact that the bees rely on their own selves for a sense of warmth in the winter was always fascinating to me as well. Do they kind of hibernate, or are they kind of active?
That's a good question. So they don't hibernate in the sense that a bear hibernates. They don't ever really go to sleep. They cluster in a basketball-sized cluster, and the bees on the outside of the cluster slowly change places with the bees on the inside, and kind of like the penguins in the Antarctic.
Yeah.
They kind of take turns, and they just keep moving and keep themselves warm. And so they don't fly outside of their hive if it's below 50 degrees.
Yeah.
So in the sense, they kind of hibernate, and they just kind of eat on their honey from last year's season. And yeah.
And then, so when they're in that state, so is that when they're the most vulnerable to predators and things like that? Or do bees have predators? I guess I should ask.
Oh, yes, they definitely do. Pretty much any time around 4th of July, we always get a bear. An occasional bear will, be a rogue bear that comes through the area. And the bears, they actually, everyone thinks, Pooh Bear, they like the honey. They actually they're drawn into the bee yards because of the smell of curing honey, from nectar to honey. And when the bees do that, they fan their wings and they basically cure the honey, and there's this wafting, nectar smell that goes out into the world, and the bees are drawn in because of the honey curing. But they love the brood, which are the baby bees, because the baby bees are the protein, where the honey is just a lot of sugar, and that's not something that the bears really, eat a lot of. But there was one time that there was a bear that got into our hives, and it left this perfect paw print. It tore apart our hive, and it left its signature paw print right on, this frame that it had pulled out of, the bee comb.
How long does it take to repopulate a population like that? Like after you've gone through and they've wiped out a considerable amount, I would imagine.
Yeah. Well, we normally make splits in the spring, and
Can we hold on a second?
Yeah.
So back up for a second. You say splits. What is a split?
A split is how we always have winter losses. It's how we rebound from those winter losses. So
okay.
Once we get through the winter, come into spring, the queen starts, just like chickens start to lay more eggs, the queen starts to lay more eggs. We get more brood because of it. And once they start upping their population and there's an increase, that's when we can make those splits and pretty much almost close to double our numbers coming out of winter.
So basically, in essence, you're taking like half of the hive and moving it into a new hive so that it can regain and flourish. And
yep, in a nutshell. That's a whole conversation on itself. But yeah, in a nutshell.
How does that work? Like, when you do the splits, do the bees just like automatically start searching for a new queen?
Well, generally, because we're commercial beekeepers, there's different ways to do it, but generally speaking, we buy our queens and they're shipped through the United States Post Office.
Wait.
Yes, sir. We get our queens shipped from California, sometimes from Georgia, or even Hawaii. We have some Hawaiian queens that are going to be coming this spring. And there'll be 100 plus queens, and they're each in their own little cage, because queens will fight with each other, so we keep them all in their own little cage. And then there's normally loose attendant bees, which are the worker bees, and they go around, and the queens make this really cute, I think it's cute,
right,
but cute little noise that's like, it's called piping, and queens will kind of go meep 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 meep, and that's them asking, hey, I need water, hey, I need food, hey, I need, attention or something. And sometimes we'll have a box of queens sitting on our stairs, to keep them warm inside of our house. And at nighttime, you'll hear the little piping noises, and
wow,
it's kind of fun. the interesting things of being a beekeeper. But
that's fascinating. So how do you go through the process of selecting your queens then? Is there like a shopping catalog for queens, or you just you've been in the business long enough now that you have all these connections?
We have a lot of connections. We have, the queens that have worked really well for our style of beekeeping. There's different types of, so we run European honeybees, commercial beekeepers, or if you're wanting to start a hive, that's the European honeybee.
Yeah.
And but then there's different breeds. So just like there's dog, and then there's Chihuahua, and then there's Husky. Well, there's European honeybee, which is like dog. And then there's, Carniolan, Italian, Cordovan. So there's the breeds of European honeybee. So we mostly run Italians. And then even to get more confusing, Cordovan is a subspecies of Italian.
Okay.
So there's just different layers, but they all originated from Europe. So the European honeybee isn't actually native to America, whereas there are 400 different species of native bees in Oregon.
Yeah.
Yes. And then there's 40 different species of bumblebees alone. So
that's a lot.
Yes.
And the amazing part of the biodiversity of bees too is that they all have very slight variations in what they need.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, they all have their niches in their environment.
Yeah.
It's pretty neat.
And like, I've always been a huge fan of bees in particular, but then you hear all of these people say that, and I want to affirm that this is true. Without bees, there is no us.
Pretty much. I think that humans and honeybees, or just bees in general, pollinators, are tied at the hip. We need each other. We need to be supported by each other. I always say we take care of the bees, but they take care of us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
100%. And so another thing that I found fascinating about your company is that you have beehives all over the place and like even different states. It's like,
Yep.
how the heck do you get bees to transport from Washington to, say, California, for example?
Yeah, that's a good
How does
question.
that work?
Yeah. So generally speaking, our bees are in Oregon and we mostly pollinate valley pollinated crops. However, right now, and my husband just got back from taking the bees to the California almond pollination.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much our bread and butter. And most commercial beekeepers do that to make their living. Um, that's a crop that takes about 2 hives per acre. And we take them down there right about the beginning of February for 6 weeks. They sit down there and we pick them up middle of March. And I say it's like dropping your kid off at kindergarten or school, and you leave them and you hope nothing happens to them. Well,
Yeah.
we're back here in Oregon and we're just hoping that our bees do well, and and that we can go pick them up in March and that they're just fine.
How do you get them down there?
Trucking. We
Trucking.
hire semi drivers. We have uh, a couple of really neat semi drivers we work with every year. One of them's actually a lady who's in her 60s. She's just a hoot and a half, and just this little lady that she gets it done for us, and helps tie down the nets and everything, because we put them up on these semis, big flat
Yeah.
semis, and then we have to net them, and they pretty much have to continuously move up down the freeway to keep that cool wind on the fronts of the fronts of the hive, excuse me, so that the bees don't start to come out. And if they stop for fuel, they have to be pretty quick about it. If they stop for too long, then the bees will start to come out if it's warm enough, and then they'll get confused on where their hive is, and then we might lose some. So we pretty much work with these semi drivers that know what they're doing and are very supportive, and they don't make any stops that are unnecessary.
So as you're transporting the cold temperature of the air of the trucks moving down meets that temperature threshold that says it's too cold for us to leave the hive.
Yeah.
That's so awesome.
Yeah.
Like, I always thought it would be like on planes and stuff like that, but it's the trucks. That's pretty
Yep.
awesome.
Yeah.
And then is that just like the California and the almond fields, or are there others?
As far as the taking them down on the semis, on the nets, with the nets, yeah, that's the main one. That's the only one we deal with, the semis doing the trucking for us, and throwing the nets. For all of our valley pollination, we do all of our moving at night, because that's another thing. If it's nighttime, the bees can't see, so they don't generally leave their hive. So we do our bee moving from pollination to pollination at night, and then we don't have to worry about netting them.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And like, I just try to put myself in the position of being a bee and how confusing that must be to wake up and you're in an entirely different zip code.
Yeah.
That's so wild to
Yep.
me. And like, so like when you're talking about pollination and the importance of pollination and plants like that, like, have you, because I remember the horror stories from like a decade or 20 years ago that said, bees are now endangered.
Yeah.
Is that still sort of the same, like, general knowledge of what's going on?
It's been a rough year, I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah.
For all commercial beekeepers across the country, not just for us. But I didn't want this interview to be like doom and gloom. I wanted to have a lot more, positive to say, but it's agriculture, so there definitely are up and downs, and generally speaking, when we have a hive loss, or hive losses, we generally know what causes it.
Okay.
So yeah, and varroa mites is a big one for that issue.
Varroa mites?
Yep, varroa mites. There's 2 different types of mites. There's the tracheal mites, which live in the bee's trachea tubes, and then there's the varroa mite, which looks like a bee version of a tick. It's something, a mite that likes to suck the bee's blood, the hemolymph, and lives kind of on the back of the bee. And the mite's not as big of the issue. The issue is that it transmits viruses. And so there's lots of different viruses that will, impact the health of the hive. Israeli paralysis virus, deformed wing virus. That one's sad because the bee emerges as a baby bee for the first time, and because of this virus, it doesn't have wings, or the wings are deformed and it can never fly. So those types of things. But we like to try to combat the virus problem that the mites create with using essential oils in the hives.
Okay.
So yeah, it's
How did you learn that?
lots of bee conferences
Oh, that's
and YouTube
fascinating.
videos and just reading up on it. It's one of those kind of hippy dippy things, but we feel like it actually does help.
Yeah.
Um, so we use, I can't remember. This is more my husband's kind of wheelhouse, but we use like peppermint oil, a lot of those kind of, kind of spicier essential oils, and that helps combat those viruses.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So how did you get started in bees to begin with?
I was hoping you would ask me that question. Um, so when I was in middle school, my family decided to move from the Willamette Valley up to Hood River, up to
Uh-huh.
the Columbia Gorge. And so that area is just, there's just so many orchards. And our house was surrounded by orchards. So I was like living in the center of an orchard essentially. And I was just surrounded by the orchards, and I felt like bees are the backbone of agriculture. And I've always been an Aggie. I've always loved nature. And so for me, it was like, that's what I want to do. I want to be a beekeeper. So I saved up my babysitting money and I bought myself my first hive, and my parents were very supportive, but they didn't really want anything to do with it. They weren't stoked about getting stung or going out there with me or anything. So it was something, and this was kind of back before YouTube was that popular, or all the different avenues of resources people
Yeah.
have these days. There wasn't even a bee club in the Columbia Gorge at the time. It was started years after I had originally started my hive. But anyway, so I kind of started out cold, didn't have a lot of friends or family that knew what was going on, or what, how to help me. So I just read a lot of books.
What was
Yeah.
the biggest surprise for you when you first started
Oh,
in terms of like maintaining and keeping a beehive?
that's a good question. Biggest surprise. Um, I guess that it's not really just an easy, hands-off thing. It's very involved. It's an animal, it's a dog. It's you have to constantly, be checking on them, see if they need something. There was a fleeting moment in my childhood I wanted to be a veterinarian, and so I kind of feel like by starting beekeeping, I became an insect veterinarian. And every
Yeah.
time you open up the hive, you're diagnosing, are they hungry? Are they queenless? Are they, any of those problems? So I guess it was just a little more involved than I realized in the beginning.
So let's say you're doing that. You're opening up the hive, you're doing the investigation, and they're indicating like they're hungry.
Mm-hmm.
What's the solution for that?
That would be, you would feed them
Right?
in a nutshell.
But like, do you just get
Yeah,
more plants
yeah.
or?
So for that, if they're really, really hungry and they're actually to the point where they're sticking their heads in the cell because they are in starvation mode, um, and they're, cold and they're doing that, then you would feed them a substitute. So you feed them sugar water, like 1 part sugar, 1 part water. If it's going into the fall, you don't want to give them as much water in that sugar solution because they're going to have to evaporate more of that water out. So you do like 2 part sugar, 1 part water as you go into the fall. In the spring and summer, you can do 1 to 1, but um, and then if they're needing more of a protein boost, then you could give them a protein pollen patty, which is kind of it looks like a giant pancake, but it's kind of gives them that protein boost that they may need if there's a nectar dearth or a pollen dearth.
And they just intrinsically know that that's there and it's food, and they just kind of.
Yep.
That's
Yes.
so fascinating.
Yeah.
That's so fascinating. And then in terms of like the drones, right? What's their radius? How far do they travel on a daily basis?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the drones kind of have just, I think of it as like the bar hangout. Like when the drone, the male bee, there's the 3 bees. There's the drone, which is the boy bee, the worker, which is the female, but a sterile female. And then there's the queen, the mother queen, and she's the one that lays all the eggs. And so when the drone, the boy bee goes out, he goes down to the local drinking hole, and I call that the drone congregation area,
I love it.
and to hang out with his guy friends, and they just kind of hang out waiting and hoping that there might be a queen needing to be mated that will fly nearby. And then they do their drone thing and help the next generation. But for the workers, they'll go out, and there's a lot of different research being done on the range of worker bees when they're collecting nectar. Generally speaking, we say about 1 mile radius away from their hive, but they have found, some workers have gone even up to 12 miles when there's a huge nectar dearth and they just need to go further and further for that little flower. But yeah, about 1 mile radius.
And then are there particular plants that people should be using
That's a good
that
question.
help sort of sustain bees, if you will?
Yeah, there's a whole bunch. That's like a whole master gardener topic that I have books that I reference on,
Right.
because I don't have them memorized, but they seem to really love lavender. I like to plant things or tell people about things that are going to be blooming during those nectar dearths.
Yeah.
So they're going to be, there's going to be lots of things for them to be eating through spring and summer, but come the end of July through kind of October, that's the nectar dearth, is the fall time. So I would say more so than even planting, if you have a little bit of acreage and you're getting dandelions and Queen Anne's lace that are popping up, I call them ditch weeds. Don't
just let them.
Don't mow them. Let them, or if you do decide to mow them, maybe try to do it at dusk or sometime when the bees aren't really out there working, so you're not stealing their their nectar right as they're kind of going for it.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And then in terms of, like you said, use the term dearth.
Yeah.
What does that mean exactly?
It means that there is no nectar at all for them to collect. So we call it a nectar dearth. There's a kind of a food shortage, or it's all dried up because it's so hot, after.
So like in those 100-degree temperatures in the summer.
Yeah, that'll dry up the nectar. It will, the flower will start to fade and wither and dry up, and then so does the nectar.
So anything you can do in those hot months to make sure that your garden flowers are blooming.
Yeah, that would be very helpful for the bees.
And do bees sort of like, also sort of like, if let's say the temperature gets over 100 degrees, will they adjust their hours that they leave the hive if it's too hot?
Yeah, in a sense. What we find is that when it's super duper hot and we're getting over 100, they switch from nectar foraging to collecting water. And so they basically turn their hive into an AC unit. They stop caring about the food and storing away for winter, and they just try to keep their wax from melting. And it's interesting because the honeybee hive, I equate it to a human body.
Yeah.
And so they like to keep their hive the same temperature as the human body, pretty much. It's somewhere around, and I'm not a numbers girl, but it's somewhere around like 97 degrees, similar to the human body. Even in the wintertime, it's that temperature.
So like if you were to put out like a bird fountain, for example, in those really hot months.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a whole, you could look on Pinterest, there's watering bees in the summertime, and people put out water in the bird fountains, but they'll put marbles in there so the bees don't drown, or they'll put little chunks of bark or styrofoam or something to keep the bees from drowning, or burlap.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, that way you don't get them swirling and dying when you're trying to help them, and then they're not making it.
That's, because like I spend a lot of time making sure that I have stuff for hummingbirds in those times of years.
Yep.
I didn't equate honeybees or bees in general to that same kind of thing.
Yeah.
That's so fascinating. And how do they communicate? Or do we know yet?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question too. A lot of it's frequency. And so there's even like vibrations that they'll put out that, we might not even hear for our human ears, but it's all kind of frequency stuff, the way they kind of, jiggle their wings, and they can feel it through their feet. So yeah, frequency is
And
how they
it's
help
a
each other.
pure collective too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where like it's like instantaneous how they change their behaviors based on whatever's happening around them.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah, they all work for the Queen Mother, and they they're all martyrs. I mean, they're willing to sacrifice their life to protect their hive. You know, they have their one stinger, and it has a barb on the end. So when they sting, it pulls out their intestines, and that's it for them. And they are fine with it because they protected their home.
that's so fascinating. And
Yeah.
so why is it important? So, and one of the things that I talk to ad nauseum about this podcast, and I'll talk about every single podcast, is the importance of like community and local.
Yeah.
And so, like, why is it important when people are looking at consuming honey or buying honey why is it important to shop local?
Well, for one, you're getting your, I call it plant medicine.
Yeah,
So when you're buying local raw honey, you're getting trace amounts of pollen that help with your allergies. You're helping your local neighbor like me, the beekeeper, backyard beekeeping. And so it's just kind of supporting that cycle of local. Yeah.
and then tell me about like because you said that there was, and thank you by the way, you brought me this amazing gift of pure raw honey from you said the meadow foam.
Yes.
Tell
So
me a little bit about that.
yeah, so meadow foam is a crop that's only grown here in the Willamette Valley. It was actually found down in the redwoods, I believe. And then I believe it was OSU that was able to collect the seeds and propagate them into a type of crop that they now grow for pressing the oil for skin products.
Yeah,
And so when we put the bees out on the meadow foam, it's that really, really short to the ground white crop that's like blindingly
that's
white.
what that
It looks
is.
like snow on the ground, and it
Yeah.
blooms in sometime around May. I always think meadow foam in May. Um, and it has this really distinct marshmallow flavor that makes it special to our area. And so there's a bit of a following for the meadow foam honey.
And so how long so you've been at this since you were a kid.
Yep.
Like when did you make the leap into like this hobby farm into an actual business?
Yeah, so I started about 15 years ago with my first hive. I even had a name for my queen. Her name was Peggy because she
I love it.
she had a peg leg, and
Oh,
she
fascinating.
was still able to get around and lay all the eggs she needed, but she had this one peg legged. And anyway, so Peggy. But uh I just loved it so much. I when I was a child, I had been stung right in my third eye, right in the middle of my forehead, and my parents, it's like a sign I'm going to be a beekeeper. And so after I graduated high school, a couple days, I think I graduated on a Friday, and then that next Monday I started working for the most close beekeeper in our area, just right up the road, for another commercial beekeeper, and learned so much from him. And um and I then I think I just was just thinking it would be a really neat career, self-employed, be part of nature. Um, and so then I went to LBCC, our local community college, and went for an agriculture business degree. And everything, just all the stars aligned. And then I got a job at the OSU Honeybee Lab, and I started doing work with the grad students and extension work. And then I went to the Oregon State Beekeeper Conference, and that's where I met my husband. And now we run the bees together. And it's gotten to the point with my honey bottling business that, I used to work side by side with my husband for, a good, I think it was about 8 years.
Yeah.
And then the honey bottling was just, I was doing it on the weekend, I was doing it at night, and I couldn't do both the beekeeping full time and also the honey bottling. So I've kind of switched gears. I've become more of the homesteading, honey bottler. And so he still runs the bees, I still help, but the honey bottling business is kind of where I'm at right now. Yeah.
And so how do you get the bees to be in like that calm state? Like
That's a
I
good
see
question.
like
Yeah.
you see the smoke thing and
Yes.
like what is that stuff?
Yeah. So I always laugh because, you get asked by your doctor, do you smoke? And I go, just the bees, just the bees. So, yeah, so we use this smoker tin can that has been around since the 1800s.
Yeah.
We use burlap and wood pellets, and it just basically there's no one really quite knows why the bees calm down so much, but the main theory is that it just masks their pheromones. So when you open up the hive, they put out this pheromone, I believe it's called Nasonov pheromone. It's the alarm pheromone, and it kind of smells like bananas. And so you smoke them, you give them a light smoke. If you're a really good beekeeper, you might give them a little light smoke in the entrance to, like, hey, knock on their front door, hey, I'm coming in, I'm going to
Yeah.
open up your hive. And then you kind of lightly smoke them, and then it just masks that pheromone, so they all just kind of stay calm, and the other thing is, going back to the frequency thing,
Yeah.
if you're ripping open that hive lid like you're a bear, and you're just pulling it out, and you're dropping bees and rolling bees everywhere, and you're thumping things around, they're not going to like that. So you got to move with ease, and you got to be calm and kind of zen, and you're going to open it up, and they're really calm as long as you're calm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then when you open them up, and it's like, so you mean like very deliberate, slow movements as to limit the trauma that they may experience.
Yeah. And every time you go into a hive, you might think you're doing them good, but in a sense, you are setting them back, because they had this was over here how they liked it, and this was over here how you liked it, and then you go and you kind of rip some of the comb and stuff, so they have to set everything back into place. So you want to try to go in and be as deliberate and non-invasive as possible.
And how often do you have to go in and inspect a hive?
It depends on the time of the year. I would say about once every 2 to 3 weeks.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not too terribly often, and sometimes we do as much as once a week. That's pretty, I'd say, invasive, but yeah, once every 3 weeks. During certain times of the year, we need to check on them more often, because, say, springtime is swarm season.
Yeah.
So then we need to go in and make sure that they're not building swarm cells and wanting to supersede their queen, and their way of kind of, it's like a cell that's reproducing and separating. They like to swarm, so they leave part of the hive behind, and then the other part goes off and finds a new place to live, a new hive hollow or whatever.
So they kind of broadcast that they're going to do that?
Yeah.
In a way?
Yeah.
That's so fascinating. That's so fascinating.
Yeah, they start drawing out, we call them swarm cells, but they're queen cells.
Yeah.
So then they can, I think they leave with the old queen. They put her on a little diet regimen. They make her lose weight right before they leave with the old queen, and then the new queen that emerges, she actually doesn't emerge until the old queen leaves, and then when she emerges, she kind of takes over the new hive.
It's almost like they know that the queen is gone, and then.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Between frequency and pheromones, they know what they're doing, I think, far more than we do.
And this is the idea of they have sort of like their own independent ecosystem.
Yeah.
That is replicatable and like movable. That's fascinating. So like I see like the beehives and the bee boxes and stuff like that. If you're talking about like bees in the wild, where do they normally make their hives?
So generally in a tree hollow or someplace that's nice and warm. I've even, been to this church where they had a swarm move into the chimney. So they like that kind of vertical, upright tree hollow type warm environment.
And I'm going to throw this out there, and I'm going to assume you're on the same page. If you stumble across a beehive, y'all, that is a honey beehive, don't call an exterminator.
Yeah.
Please call somebody who will take those bees and move them somewhere else. Don't kill a hive.
Yeah.
Please, I beg you.
Yeah. There's actually a really great resource. The Oregon State Beekeepers Association, OSBA. You can go on their website, and they have like a swarm call list. So if you get a swarm hanging in your tree, you can call, and generally speaking, it will be a hobbyist beekeeper that will want to start up their first hive, and they'll go collect that for you.
And they would come like at dusk and all that stuff, right?
I guess it just depends on their work schedule.
I
But
guess,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, they can really come at any time of the day to collect, to to shake the swarm into their box. They can pretty much do it at any time of the day, but to then go collect their swarm off of that person's property and then bring it back to their own, that's when you'd want to do it at nighttime.
Yeah,
So you
because
don't
you want all the bees to come
all
back.
inside. Yep.
Hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
And then in terms of like the professional beekeeper aspect of it, like, are you always looking for new places to put your hives, or do you sort of have everything sort of mapped out?
Yeah. So we have, my husband has honey yards that he has started up back when he was in high school. And so a lot of them are just these grandfathered in yards that we go back to every single year.
Yeah.
However, if we're having a year where we have this really big increase, sometimes we are looking for honey yards. Or if we have honey yards that are too close together, I kind of equate it to cattle. You don't want to overgraze. So we try to keep, we keep hives of 32 hives per yard. And we try not to put another yard in that's within, 1 mile. So we try to go 1 or 2 miles away between sets.
And so what's the requirement to be a bee yard? What kind of things are you looking for? Like, you say, okay, if you have this, I want to put my bees there.
Yeah, well, there are times we go in and we get them kind of riled up. Honey harvest is a big one.
Yeah.
And so they're going to be kind of, up in the air, and they're going to, I wouldn't want this to be in a neighborhood or anything. It's generally somebody's, back 40.
Yeah.
That's their cattle pasture as well, and a place that we can drive our trucks into with our forklifts and trailers, turn around and everything, have lots of room.
Yeah, because it's not like a one box deal. It's a whole setup.
Yeah, we keep about 32 hives, and each we keep 4 hives per pallet. So that's kind of what that looks like. So it's not that big of an area, but it's more that we don't want to get anything riled up and then have somebody's dog get stung or something for it.
And then so like when you have those 4 hives per pallet, do they just kind of instinctively know this is their hive and they like don't cross?
Yeah, that's a good question too. So there's something called drifting or drift, and that's if you were to put all of your hives in a row, then the bees will drift into the end hives because they'll get confused as the orientation. So we like to change the orientation of our pallets, and oftentimes we will do like a horseshoe shape or something, or change the orientation of the hive entrances so that the bees know which apartment to go into and they don't go in the wrong spot, or drift into one big monster hive and then there's a bunch of little dink hives.
And then when that happens, does that cause problems with the other hives?
If there's a drifting issue, yeah, there would be a problem, because you would have this just one really big hive, and then you would have lots of little hives that need attention and are very small.
And basically they're cutting off their own supply of pollen and everything else.
Yeah. Okay. And then yeah.
And then what about the bottling or the process of collecting the honey?
Yeah. It is a lot of work.
Yeah. I don't think people appreciate how much work goes into it.
It's funny because I think a jar of our honey is cheaper than a dozen eggs these days, and I'm like, that's not right.
That shouldn't be right.
But I mean, it is a lot of work, and I don't think that most people really have the backbone to cut it for the honey harvest. But so in a nutshell, it is it's wearing a full body, bee suit. Mm-hmm. So, that layer, and then the veil and everything. And we're pulling honey. Our honey harvest is kind of right before that nectar dearth. So then we can collect most of the honey that the bees have collected most of the year, and then leave them what they need to get through the winter. But we're looking at, the beginning of August, sometimes the end of July, for when we harvest the honey. So we're going out in these already kind of hot and heavy bee suits. It's already 100 degrees out there, and we're pulling, working with these stinging insects. We're pulling these 60-pound, bee boxes off full of honey. It's sticky, heavy, tiring job, and everybody on the crew drinks about a gallon of water a day just to just to keep going.
And so basically when you open the hive, you basically remove the entire block of honey?
Yeah, so the way that there's different configurations. We run 10 frame bee boxes. There's
Okay.
also 8 frame. 8 frame's a little lighter. That's those two are the most common ways of running bees commercially, 8 frame and 10 frame. So two boxes each with 10 frames, so there's 20 frames, and then we put a queen excluder on top of those 2 boxes, which are probably about that, that tall.
Okay.
The queen excluder is essentially like this metal grid that's the bars are close enough together that the queen, because she's bigger, cannot fit herself up through them. So only the workers can go up to the top boxes. The top boxes, we call them supers. They're the honey boxes.
Okay.
And so when we go to collect the supers, the honey harvest boxes, there's generally, unless there's a bend in a wire and the queen got herself up there, there's not going to be any brood or baby bees that we have to deal with. It's just pure honey. Yeah.
And then it's actually cutting the honey off of the frame,
yes, right? Yeah. So we actually work with another beekeeper. He does all of our commercial extracting, the whole process for us. Because we don't have the facility right now. We're working towards building a honey house, but that's like a little bit down.
A lot of money, a lot of work.
Yes,
yeah.
Uh-huh. Yes. So it's a little bit ways down the road, but he does it for us, and then we just pay him for his service there. But he's got these big vats, and they're the big extractors. And so basically, you cut the beeswax. There's a layer of beeswax when the nectar's been cured into honey in the comb. They put a layer of beeswax over, and that's like, if you're into canning or anything, that's like the seal on top of your product. So then they know, okay, this is done, curing. We're going to save this for the winter. So anyways, we cut that beeswax capping off, and then we put them in these extractors, and the centrifugal force pushes the honey out. And that way we can reuse that comb the next year, because comb is very expensive. Okay. Yeah, it's very expensive for the hive to architect. It takes about 12 pounds of honey to make 1 pound of beeswax. And so by just cutting off that little layer, that little capping on the outside of the frame, the bees, we give them back their frame, and then they're able to reuse that comb the next year, and we're not wasting it as much.
And I would imagine it also takes a lot of energy and everything else on the bees to recreate the whole framework.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's fascinating. And then the beeswax itself, they have separately, and then that's where you get all the beeswax stuff that you
see. Then they're able to separate that from the honey product. We get our honey back. Sometimes we get some beeswax back as well. We don't really make too much beeswax because we don't, pull apart the whole hive. We just, that little bit of cappings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so how much honey comes out of one hive?
That's a good question too. We here in Oregon, we're not a great honey producing state.
Okay.
The better honey producing states are more like the Midwest area.
Oh, interesting.
And that's where you're getting a lot of the clover honey. And so when people say, they want regular honey or something, I think they're generally thinking of clover honey, but every single honey is all going to have its own flavor profiles.
Yeah.
And you might really like meadow foam, but you might really not like buckwheat. And they're not only different flavor profiles, but different colors. And even the honey, sorry, tell me if I'm digressing here, but
no, not at all.
even the honey, like going back to the meadow foam, it comes from the nectar of the flower. But then there's some honeys, especially in Germany, that are the honeydew. And so that comes from the aphids will secrete the sugary syrup that comes from the aphid insect, and then the bees will collect the aphid juice, and they make honeydew honey. And then there's something in New Zealand, I believe, that manuka and kanuka honey, both of those, it's tree honey. And so there's a tree, that the manuka tree, that will excrete this little hair. There's these little hairs that come out of the trunk of the tree, and you can run your hand over the tree, and your hand will be like maple syrup, and the bees will collect the manuka honey off this tree hair, and even we make a local tree honey, the maple blossom honey.
Yeah.
And that comes from catkins that hang down
Oh, fascinating.
from the maple trees around the rivers. Yeah. So there's even different sources of honey. It's not just from the flower, from the nectar of the flower.
And
Yeah.
how predictable is the flavor profile every year, though? Are you pretty much, you could say like you pretty much guarantee that meadow foam's always going to taste kind of like meadow foam?
Yeah. Meadow foam is very distinctive, very much marshmallow vanilla taste. But even in the, 10 years that I've been in this area making meadow foam, it has changed not only in flavor but also in color. Our meadow foam used to be much darker than it is now.
Okay.
It also used to be much stronger marshmallow taste than it is now. And again, this is a working theory, but I think that might have something to do with maybe the farmers and how they're, genetically um, breeding for trying to get the meadow foam to produce more oil might be changing the plant itself, and then the plant is making less nectar for it.
I didn't even think about that.
Yeah.
And like how much of a chain reaction, just like you change one thing in an ecosystem and it can have generational impacts on all kinds of species.
Yeah. Also, the rainfall will impact the flavor profiles of honey.
Fascinating.
Yeah. The years that we don't have as much rain, not only do we make less honey because less saturated, less nectar being produced, but the less rainfall years, we also get a much darker honey. And the honey that we make the most of is actually the blackberry blossom.
Okay.
It's kind of what Oregon's known for,
Yep.
blackberry blossom honey. And but the years where we get just a lot of rain, very light in color and a much more mild, a little bit less sweet, and concentrated tasting than the years where there's less rain.
And then you said when we first started about the benefits of consuming honey and how it sort of helps with sort of the seasonal allergies.
Yep.
And that brings me back to, again, the local conversation, because like if you are not sourcing local honey, it's not going to have that same sort of impact on the local pollens that you're encountering.
Yeah. You definitely want to make sure that your honey is not pasteurized, which raw is not pasteurized.
Yeah.
Not filtered. If it's filtered, then you're filtering out the trace amounts of pollen, and by doing so, then you are not only getting a sweetener in your tea, but you're getting a little bit of medicine, and you're being able to interact with your local flora for it.
And isn't honey like one of the few substances on earth? Because I heard there was they found some honey that was like thousands of years old and it was still safe for human consumption.
Yeah, and the Egyptian tombs, the pyramids, the Egyptians they knew what was up. They worshipped the bees. I mean, the bees were very sacred, and I believe that honey, and that's why I guess I feel like my heart and soul is in the honey bottling business, but also, keeping our hives so healthy is that there's just this like medicinal value there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how can people support your local beekeeper?
Well, it's always great to buy local.
Yeah.
I buy our local eggs, and I try to I do a lot of horse trading. Actually, I'll trade honey for things I need, and also supporting us by it's the small things. Just not even mowing your lawn when there's dandelions popping up, and trying to retrain your brain into weeds are just an opinion. Think of them as flowers, and then maybe hopefully your neighbor doesn't judge you for your lawn looking a little derelict for a while, because that's bee food.
And the irony of the modern United States lawn, it hasn't escaped me.
Yeah.
Because like none of our lawns, that wasn't even a thing. It was sort of based on this wild picture of what they thought a lawn would work like. None of these grass lawns in the traditional sense are native to Oregon.
Yeah. I know our pastures, just to anyone else, it would look like a mess, but I love it. There's plantain, and there's all, dandelions, and there's all these different weeds, and it's just an ecosystem. And I go out there, I see bumblebees out there, and it makes me very happy.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
So how can people find out more information about your company?
Well, we're pretty small. we have a Facebook page,
Mhm.
Coffman Farms LLC on Facebook, and that's pretty much it. I supply about 30 different stores with our honey here in the Mid Willamette Valley.
Is there a list of those stores on your Facebook page?
We don't have a list yet, but I should probably put one together. Some of the kind of bigger stores, I'll just do a quick little in
Yeah,
a
please.
nutshell. Here in Salem, there's Life Source Natural Foods, Copper Creek Mercantile. In the Corvallis area, there's Garland's Nursery and the Oregon Coffee and Tea. And in kind of our neck of the woods, there's my husband's family's master appliance business, and they sell their appliances, but then they sell our honey there on their counter too.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and they're just their family, so they love us and support us. But and then also Old Mill Feed Store, Ag West Feed Store. Those are kind of the main. Those are the main ones, but we also have a lot of farm stands in the summer and that are more seasonal.
And then in terms of like just honey in general and bees in general, any last comments for people that should just be aware of, or something maybe I didn't ask?
Oh, I could keep going for another few hours.
I can keep going too.
Okay.
So
Let's see. I wanted to talk about bee venom.
oh, please.
Yes.
Yes.
So I don't know too much.
You
but
mean
I
like in
wanted to-
cosmetics?
For lots of different health issues.
Okay.
Yeah, so there's this really great, and I'm more of a resource person. I want the listener to kind of go out there and find their answers, because my brain can't remember everything by any means,
Oh,
even though
100%.
it's my lifestyle. But there's this really great website called healhive.com, and it talks about apitherapy, which is a really fancy word for getting stung by honeybees.
Okay.
And people do it on purpose. There's a lot of scientific research. It's this really cutting edge scientific thing right now where they're looking into bee venom like medicinally, and how it's helping with Lyme disease, fertility issues, breast cancer. And basically, again, I know I've used the word medicine quite a bit, but like honey, I feel like bee stings and bee venom is medicinal because of what they're eating. I mean,
Yeah.
it's plant medicine. They're going out and they're eating, pollen and honey and these different things, and then it comes through their venom. So they've actually found that I mean, as long as you're not very allergic to getting stung, that it can help reduce inflammation in the body. And I know when I injured myself, so here's where we take care of the bees and they take care of us. I had injured myself working our hives because they're super heavy. I mean, we're talking hundreds of pounds all day long. And I had injured my shoulder and it wasn't really healing. And so I had stung myself on purpose kind of around the rotator cuff. And it was the one thing that actually helped me recover from a pretty bad shoulder injury. Yeah.
So do they have like treatments that are like bee venom, like that you rub on, or do you have to like get stung?
You'd have to get stung. Yeah. So, I mean, it takes a little bit of grit. It's not for everyone. And there's a lot of that. You thank the bee for giving you that medicine.
Yeah.
Because they're giving their life for you. But it really has helped me in a lot of ways.
I had no idea.
Yeah. And the bee venom, a lot of people, when they get stung, they'll say, oh, I got stung by a bee. Well, generally speaking, you're probably getting stung by a yellow jacket, because those turds are
aggressive.
They are aggressive. I call them bee sharks.
Yeah.
They like to eat honeybees, so they're an issue for the bees. But the yellow jacket has a higher venom toxicity than the bee does. And in fact, I actually knew of a lady that had gotten stung on the Oregon coast by a yellow jacket. She wasn't allergic to yellow jackets, but she was allergic to shellfish. And the yellow jackets had been eating the dead crabs and, shellfish on the coast. And so when she got stung, she got that through the venom. So that's what I'm saying. A yellow jacket sting is much different than a honeybee sting because of what they're eating.
Yeah.
The yellow jacket's a carnivore and they're eating, roadkill.
Yeah.
The honeybee is eating flower medicine. So
that's fascinating.
Yeah. Even different between stinging insects.
And are African honeybees still a problem?
No, that was definitely a concern there for a while. I feel like that was more of in the 80s kind of.
Yeah.
But what is still kind of sort of an issue for some beekeepers is the genetics of the Africanized honeybees. Um, and so one of the reasons we don't generally like to get Georgia queens is because they're kind of in that vicinity, that area where there are some of those Africanized honeybees, or killer bees, as some people know them to be. And so those drones, those Africanized honeybee drones, will mate with the potential queens.
Yeah.
And then when they get shipped to us, our bees will be really, really grumpy for it. They'll be sassy pants. And so we like to keep our bees a little calmer. So, when we're working them near neighborhoods and stuff, they're not going out and bothering anybody. But
Okay.
there are some queen breeders where the genetics of those Africanized honeybees can still be a problem in the queens that they ship.
And
Yeah.
then in terms of like the bee population itself and like all of the different kind of bees, like the other thing that I keep saying is like buying bee boxes. Do those help? Like, should people continue to buy those sort of bee boxes that you see on the internet?
Are you talking about like the flow hive, or just in,
They have
or
these
like
ones
in?
that I saw where they
Yeah,
actually have the bees in the box or whatever, and then you put them outside, and then they, I guess,
yeah, yeah.
come to being somehow.
Um, there are so many different configurations and things out there for sale that try to get somebody in, get somebody into something. I know for a while something called the flow hive was very popular, um, which is essentially a Langstroth hive, which is what we run.
Yeah.
The two boxes of woodenware, and then there's this special super or honey box sitting on top that pulls apart the comb, and then you go out there with your stack of pancakes and you get your honey on it. And that wouldn't work for us commercially, but I say to each his own. If it gets you excited, try it.
Yeah.
And
Because I'm going to guess
yeah,
there's no such thing as too many bees.
well, there can be,
Okay.
if but only in just like an area,
Yeah.
like with the cattle. Like, you don't want to overgraze an area because then they're going to get hungry. But you know, I think I think it's important for the next generation to get excited about beekeeping too. Um,
100%.
yeah, but I also think that if you want to get into bees, it's just it's like before you get a horse or a dog, you want to make sure that you're well prepared for it, and that you're going to be able to, love them and take care of them really, really well. And even though they're, a stinging insect, they're just like a dog. You want to make sure you're fully prepared. And so I would say join a local bee club. And the Oregon State Beekeepers Association is a really great reference for that, because there's like bee clubs all over Oregon.
And I would imagine with something like a bee club, you're going to be way more accepting and inclusive than some of the other clubs out there.
Yeah, yeah. You're going to be learning so much from how other people did things, right or wrong.
Yeah.
And that way, hopefully, you're not on the journey alone, and oh, if my hive has this problem, this is what I need to do to fix it, or this is where I can go to buy this for my hive. A really supportive group of people. They're always bringing in guest speakers, so you're getting to learn about really neat topics. In fact, our local bee club here in the Dallas area, they brought in a guest speaker one time. Her name's Lynn Royce,
Mm-hmm.
and she specializes in the wild hives and studying wild hives and how they're able to survive and thrive in some points, and what their cavities look like, and the whole ecosystem of a wild hive. And commercial beekeepers, or anybody keeping a hive, you're keeping it here at ground level,
Yeah.
but that's not how they do it in the wild. They're always up in a tree way, way above. So it's a
Oh.
whole different ecosystem and climate, because when they're down here on the ground, it's going to be this moisture content, it's going to be this temperature. But when they're up in a tree hollow, it's going to make for a different environment for them. And
And they could probably make adjustments for airflow and all kinds of
yeah,
things that.
yeah. And I've even heard of where the yellow jackets
Yeah.
and the honeybees will inhabit the same. And this was all things that Lynn Royce had found, that she found this one cavity that the honeybees were up top of the tree hollow, the yellow jackets were down below, and the yellow jackets were eating all the bees, like cocoons and chunks of wax and just things that fell out of the hive that fell into the bottom of the cavity. Well, it was creating a lot of like bugs and things that were starting to kind of hang out in that the fallen down stuff from the beehive. And then the yellow jackets were eating on that. So it was this really happy whole ecosystem that wouldn't necessarily happen in most boxes that are commercial boxes.
And what about like the whole idea or the use of pesticides
for the farmers? Yeah.
How does that impact bees?
Well, sometimes we can tell when there is a pesticide issue. There'll be just a bunch of dead bees near or around the front entrance of our hive. For us, we generally like to do valley pollination,
Mhm.
but then we like to, pardon me, but then we like to move our hives away from agriculture into kind of more I call them like the wild spaces.
Okay.
And kind of get them, we take them away from agriculture so they can reset in the late summer, away from the pesticides and stuff. But there's this really good resource that my husband will check into when there's a farmer that says, hey, I want to spray so-and-so pesticide.
Yeah.
He'll look into that to see if it's bee safe, or if there's certain times of the day they need to spray it, or, you know, how it's going to interact with our bees. So I would love to live in an organic world where there's no sprays and we don't have to work with the farmers on it. But the reality is that we need to work together. And so by having open communication with the farmers, if they need to spray something, then we like to have the open communication of, okay, you can spray it, but here's kind of what we're finding on the safety of that chemical. Yeah.
And there's just not enough regenerative farmers out there.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I'm hoping that the organic, you know, or the using less sprays, using less chemicals, going back more to keeping it simple. I hope that catches on. And I think in some places it kind of is. Yeah.
Have you seen that the video of the regenerative farm that's right next to the monocrop big ag farm?
No.
Yeah, it's a fascinating video if you have a chance to watch it, because it's during a rainstorm, and he's showing his farm and the other farm, and the water that's coming from the regenerative farm is clear. You can't even tell that it's a runoff from a farm. Wow. And then right on the other side of the regular farm, you see all of the nutrients in the soil and all the brown water going right into the river and all that stuff. And so it's like, if there was a stark comparison that people could see as to like the difference between a regenerative farm and somebody that uses a lot of chemicals, it's like night and day.
Yeah. I know this one story. There's this farmer that we work with that was getting really bad aphid problem, I do believe. And a lot of farmers they work with, there's like a chemical guy that will come in and tell them, oh, you have this problem. They call him the field man. They'll come in, oh, you have this problem. You need to buy this chemical from us. Well, they have a lot to gain from selling a lot of chemicals to the farmers. Well, the farmer was like, no, I'm going to wait. Well, the field guy, oh, it's getting so bad. Your crop's not going to make it. These aphids are just taking over. And the farmer just kept saying, you wait and see. And not long afterward, this big swarm of ladybugs came in. And there were ladybugs everywhere eating all these aphids. And just like that, no problem. And sometimes I don't think that we give nature enough time to just catch up and do its thing. It knows what it's doing.
Yeah. Because people tend to forget, like, nature is always looking for the food supply.
Yep.
And so when you have like this mass migration of a particular insect that is a food supply of another one, sometimes you just want to wait for those others to get there.
Yeah.
And then, the cycle of life continues.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So we've been at it for an hour.
Okay. Well, I think those are most of the points I wanted to hit on. Thank you for inviting me here.
Oh, thank you for joining me today. Like I am so glad we had this conversation. Like I've had so many questions about bees for so many years, and this is just off my bucket list.
This is just the tip of the iceberg, though, because I had all these talking points, and I feel like some of them I could just talk a whole hour just on the one thing, But
so let's do this. Let's have you get in contact with my producer. Let's do a check-in in about 3 months, and shoot me a message on one of those rabbit holes you want to go down,
Okay.
and then we'll have a reconvening of the minds and we'll go down
Okay.
that rabbit hole.
Okay.
I would be happy to do that.
That sounds like a plan.
Awesome. And people, be kind, support local. We're in this together. Because at the end of the day, and I'll say this, say it once, I say it every single podcast, we breathe the same air, we rely on the same rock, we are here on this planet together, and we are not an exclusive community. We all rely on nature, we rely on everything to sort of sustain us, and so anything we can do to sustain them, you got to do it.
Yep.
Ciera, thank
Yeah.
you so much.
Thank you so much, Shawn.